I'm sorry, Richard, I don't know how to wait to touch screen thing.
You're going your dog.
Oh, I just had to touch it. Simple.
Brings it up. And then this will like, you bring the lights up and down, so maybe go 4.
4?
Once you want to get it in.
All right. Ready for that.
Probably not ready for touch. Oh, look at that, wow. All right, hello everybody. My name, as you probably already heard, is Holly.
My name's Abe.
And we are, of course, from Cave of the Mounds. We're both supervisors over there, and we're super excited to get to talk to you guys about the Cave of the Mounds specifically, as well as kind of speleology, the study of caves in general. We're going to go a little bit in depth into some of the other stuff, specifically with Cave of the Mounds. Hopefully we don't bore you with any of that, and if we manage to bore you with our words, we have a bunch of pretty rocks here for you guys to look at afterwards as well, if you're curious. But with that, we're going to do our presentation first, and then afterwards we'll have a short little Q&A session for any questions or anything you guys might have. But with that said, Abe's going to get us started.
All right, great. Before I say more, we have about 40 minutes, right? Is that including questions, or you want to?
Yeah, we like to finish up shortly after 8-ish.
Okay, and that,
So,
so yeah, we have
40, 45 minutes.
birthday celebration to do too, right? Okay. All right, well, I'm going to start by talking a little bit about the geology of the area where Cave of the Mounds is found. And I'm excited to talk to you folks because I bet you already know a lot about it. Let me see if I can poll the audience, I guess. How many know already the word Ordovician period? So that's like the whole room. Okay, great. So great, so here's an illustration of some of the geologic periods and eras and epochs going back through the, well, mostly we're focusing on some of the recent history here. And here's some important time markers that you might recognize. So the Ice Age is near the top here and Earth forms way back at the bottom. As you might have guessed by the question I just asked you, Cave of the Mounds limestone, the limestone in which Cave of the Mounds formed, is all the way from the Ordovician period, about 450 million years ago. And as you may know, well, you can tell by the picture here what sort of animals were living during the Ordovician. Were there many creatures on land yet? What do you think? What would be your guess, yes or no? Yeah, people are giving thumbs down. So no, things were, life on land was pretty limited. A lot of life was in the sea, and we had kind of a different sort of sea here in Wisconsin than you can find on Earth now. There was something called an epicontinental sea, a shallow sea on the continent, and I don't think there's anything quite like that around now. But these shallow seas left behind the limestone that today surrounds you when you go inside Cave of the Mounds. Here's a little video illustrating how we imagine the Ordovician Sea might have looked. So here's a creature that you might recognize. This is called a cephalopod, and so it's a broad category that includes many different animals, and still is around today. We have modern cephalopods like the squid, and these creatures in the Ordovician period came in different shapes and sizes. Some of them had coil shells, like you'll see pictured on the top. Some of the other animals that lived in this time were trilobites, and then these fern-looking things here, these are starfish cousins, or echinoderms called crinoids. Have you ever heard of those before? Okay, so all of these creatures' fossils can be found in some of Wisconsin's limestone somewhere. Not all of them can be found in Cave of the Mounds. Here's an illustration of the seafloor, and we imagine the seafloor containing some shells from these ancient creatures, eventually fossilized and became the limestone that you can find throughout southern Wisconsin now. In fact, there's a great big cephalopod fossil about 6 feet long in the ceiling of the cave.
Ask a question.
Yeah, please.
Are those animal forms or are there plant forms in there too?
Those, are you thinking of those orange ones that look kind of like ferns?
The pooey thing?
Yes, so they look like plants, but in fact, those are animals related to the starfish. And at the top of that stalk, I can play part of the video. don't know if I can fast forward through it, so we'll have to see the cephalopod come by again. But at the top of that stalk, there were these arms that sort of somehow directed floating food in those ocean down to a mouth at the base of the stalk. So maybe you know more about crinoids. If you want to add anything, go ahead.
Crinoids were an echinoderm. So as Abe has stated, they were related to starfish. So you can kind of imagine them as an upside down starfish with longer, more feather-like arms. And essentially, they would have stuck themselves into the seafloor with a holdfast or a root system, and they just kind of would have waved back and forth, usually with the current. Some of them could disconnect themselves from the bottom of the seafloor like a tumbleweed, and they would just flow along with the current. And they had a really wide range of sizes. Some of them were very, very small. The largest one that I have personally seen was over 35 feet in length. So they have a lot of variety.
Okay, so this epicontinental sea, the shallow sea on top of the continent, left behind limestone as the seafloor eventually became rock. And today, if we look at the different kinds of bedrock that are found in Wisconsin, you can find limestone kind of in this shape right here. I think it looks a little bit like a smiley face. So these green colors here, the blue, and the kind of tan and this pink, most of those are limestone. I think this darker green is a sandstone layer that's in between some limestone layers. And then Cave of the Mounds is found kind of over here. I'll try to zoom in on that. This, I believe this pink dot is a slightly younger layer of marine rock. And this is limestone. This is the spot where you can find Cave of the Mounds. I think Cave is actually this green layer here. Now, you might, I'm sorry, let me say one more thing about this. As you can see, the smiley face goes over to eastern Wisconsin and western Wisconsin. But if we look at a map of caves in the United States, these green dots here are the limestone caves. You can see the vast majority of the limestone caves in Wisconsin are confined to the southwest or found there. So why is that? I bet some of you know.
Hey, just one quick question on the previous slide.
Sure.
What formation is Cave of the Mounds in? I was trying to read that. I can't, my eyes aren't quite good enough.
So we're inside Galena Dolomite is the formation, and it's part of this, I believe it's part of this, the Sinope group. And then the pink dot is another layer that you can find at the Blue Mounds, where Cave of the Mounds is, called the Coconut Shale. Or, I'm sorry, the Coconut Formation, it says there, and there's some shale in there. So why are the limestone caves in Wisconsin down only in the southwest? Why don't we find more in the eastern half of the state?
Driftless area.
Yeah, exactly. So there were these glaciers, they left behind all this material called drift or till, and if there were limestone caves in the east, well, unfortunately, they're harder to find. They're maybe hidden under a large amount of till. Certainly, there are a few that are known in the eastern side of the state. So here where we are, we're in the glaciated area. If you go to Blue Mounds, where Cave of the Mounds is, you're in the driftless area away from all that glacial material, sometimes hundreds of feet of it. You can really see the difference on a relief map. I'm sure you've seen maps like this before. You imagine that maybe eastern Wisconsin used to be just as ridged and filled with valleys as western Wisconsin is now. Another thing about the limestone landscape we have out at Cave of the Mounds is that it's not just caves, it's got all kinds of different features where water has changed the limestone and hollowed it out. And you might find, say, a spring or a disappearing stream. One thing that we have several of that you're welcome to come and look at any time are sinkholes. There's a great big sinkhole, in particular, that we call school sinkhole that you can see. And this is a rather old photo. I think it's even a little bit larger now, 10 or 15 years since this photo was taken.
Question,
Yeah.
has anyone lost their life in a sinkhole?
Well, I'm sure in the history of the world, unfortunately, maybe there may have been someone who lost their life, but here at Cave of the Mounds, no. As far as I know in Wisconsin, I really don't know, but I don't believe anyone's lost their life in this sinkhole. But I don't know, I just don't know enough. I know enough about the cave sinkholes to say no, but outside of our little area, I can't be sure.
The limestone rock of Wisconsin, generally in this area, is very, very strong compared to areas that you think of having sinkholes, such as Florida, where they form very rapidly. And people have absolutely lost their lives in Floridian sinkholes or sinkholes in other areas. But with Wisconsin limestone, and thus with our sinkholes, they take a very long time to form. So pretty much the only way you can lose your life to one is if you aren't looking where you're walking and then you fall in and hit your head.
Rather live here.
Yes.
All right, so just a couple pictures of some of those fossils that you can find in local limestone in Blue Mounds. Of course, we have our large cephalopod, some snails, gastropods that are pretty clear. If you ask some of the tour guides when you visit, we'll be happy to point those out. We have lots and lots of crinoids. There are these crinoid columnals are little circles everywhere. This particularly clear picture. Here's a longer one. It's perhaps a little bit blurry in this picture, but you find a pretty long string of those columnals in one spot. Oh, and I better keep going here, but I want to let you know a little bit about the story before the cave was discovered and who lived in this spot. As you probably know, there was lead mining in Wisconsin before it became a state, and in the early years of its statehood, I suppose. One of those early lead miners was a guy named Ebenezer Brigham. Has anybody heard of him before? People. So he was the one who ended up buying the land from the U.S. government that now includes Cave of the Mounds. And you can see this old map here. This is from 1829. Brigham came to settle in 1828 or so. You can see the Blue Mounds here, and they're labeled Brigham's Blue Mound, which I think is interesting. A lot of the area still bears his name. And in fact, it's his descendants who own the land today, even where the cave was eventually discovered. This is the old dairy barn on the Cave of the Mounds property. His nephew ended up establishing after he died. Ebenezer Brigham himself died around this time of the Civil War. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Holly.
All right. So Abe's given, of course, a little bit of an introduction to the story of the Cave of the Mounds. We have the history. Ebenezer Brigham came here 1828 for lead mining. He had no idea that the cave was beneath his feet. He knew that there were sinkholes, but we weren't exactly sure of the connection between sinkholes and caves by that time. So Cave of the Mounds was actually discovered completely and utterly on accident on August 4th in 1939. What was occurring is that the Brigham Farm property had leased out some of their land in order to be a quarry. It was the Brigham Quarry. It started in about 1910 or so. So even starting in 1910, we still had 29 years before they even discovered the cave. And that cave was discovered at 11 a.m. on that fine morning. What they were doing is they were drilling to place TNT into the rock in order to blast it, harvest the limestone, and create County Road ID, which is going to run from Blue Mounds to Madison, because Blue Mounds was actually, despite the fact that it's very small, it was a central urban hub at that time. It was pretty much the last stop between Chicago and the West. So they were harvesting the limestone, they detonated the limestone, and you can see up here, there are a few fine gentlemen quarry workers standing above this massive hole that they ended up cracking open on that day. What we had was about a 30-foot wide hole that went straight down to the pitch blackness that they had no idea it was down there. They were completely shocked because they had no evidence whatsoever. And that's a really, really cool thing about our cave is that nobody knew it was there, and that's the fun surprises that we get while we're digging around inside the earth, as I'm sure you are all aware of what we can find. So once they discovered the cave, of course, they went through and explored the cave, and when they explored it, they managed to map it out, and what they had was this glorious, long, crescent-shaped tunnel, cavern, that they could explore to their heart's content. The entire measured length of Cave of the Mounds to this day is 1,692 feet. So we're just a little bit short of 1,700 feet even. I think they could have dug out a little bit of extra 8 feet so we could have the even number, but I guess they didn't want to do that. The only parts that really aren't accessible, like if you guys came in on a tour one of these days, the only part that you really couldn't go in is the Dream River section, which spans about 250 feet from here to the very end of the cave. Our cave kind of tapers off towards the end. So we actually have, in addition to this 250 feet, another approximately 12 that we can't really fit into. So while it's not exactly the largest cave in the world, of course, that honor generally goes to Mammoth Cave down in Kentucky, we are still a fairly sizable cave, but you will see mainly what our drawing point is a little bit later when Abe picks up talking again. But we have some really phenomenal things that you can see in there. Now, I mentioned before that it was completely accidental. They had no idea that it was here. And the really, really cool part about that is that our cave was completely and utterly untouched and unseen by human eyes upon discovery. Nothing had ever been in or out of the cave. There was never any evidence of ancient peoples existing inside the cave or doing any cave writings or anything like that. So our cave, if you look here, this is the image of the cathedral room. This is one of the many rooms inside the cave that starts off the eastern cavern for us. You can see in here we have the flat shelving of the limestone slabs that have fallen down. We have groups of stalactites in this area. And then it's hard to see here, but this chunk here is Polly the parrot, which if you've ever been to the Cave of the Mounds, you may be familiar with her. If I move to an image of today, this one being in about 1939, moving to an image of today, it's virtually the same thing. You have the limestone slabs from where they'd fallen. You have Polly the parrot just over here. Dave's maybe gonna dim the lights for us so you can see a little bit better.
We can dim that.
Perfect, it's nice and dark so I can trip on something. So we have Polly the parrot just over here in all of her glory. We have the stalactites that span this entire area, and we have all the little stalagmites that encompass the ground in that spot. If I flip back one more time, now it's a little darker, you can really see how similar they are. The biggest difference that we've made in coming into the cave is going to be this spot right here. This spot is the entrance to a man-made tunnel that we had to make inside the cave, because once you go past this point in this direction, it gets pretty narrow in that area, and eventually it gets so small that we can't really get a lot of people through there. So in the end, we did decide to make a tunnel into it. This is the most really changing, aside from the floors and the lights, that we did to Cave of the Mounds in order to make it accessible to all the guests that come in here. Another cool thing, aside from the fact that it's a one-to-one very similar between the formations then and now, is that while we don't really have any animals like bears or raccoons or anything large, bats or anything like that, we do have a little guy that looks like this. This is an itty-bitty insect known as Cecobria tenebricosa. Easier name is a springtail. Springtails are very, very small critters. They're basically the sizes of just specks of dust that sit mainly on the surfaces of the water that we have inside Cave of the Mounds. And they feast on the bacteria that comes in from the oxidation of the iron and the manganese that we have all throughout the cave that comes in through different iron ores that are hidden in the limestone, or through the manganese that's inside the dirt and the topsoil that's above our heads. And these leach into the formations, and they give them their gorgeous, gorgeous colors that you're going to see a lot of a little bit later. They're known as springtails due to this little appendage here. This is on their back end, and it gives them quite a lot of jumping force. I've personally seen them jump about 3 or 4 inches, which for something that is literally as small as a dust speck, that's pretty high. They can also kind of putter around in the water, and they're just kind of cute little things that sit in there, and they're fun to watch and look for while you're going through. Now, with Cave of the Mounds, a little bit of extra history. I just want to make it kind of known how much effort we really put into Cave of the Mounds. This was absolutely a product of love that we had when it was first discovered. So when the cave was discovered in 1939, it was discovered in August. In September of that same year, these two gentlemen, Fred Hanneman and Carl Breckler over here, they decided that they wanted to be the stewards of Cave of the Mounds. They saw something very unique here when they heard about it. They were excited about it. We don't know their exact motives for why they decided to take us under their wings, but we do know that they did a very good job. They put in a significant amount of effort in getting the walkways in, getting the lighting in, creating our lovely cave entrance building that is still standing today. If you come to visit, you can still walk through that original structure. These guys were in a bit of an anomaly because Mr. Hanneman was a band director in Mount Oro, and Mr. Breckler was a bank teller. They had nothing to do with Cave of the Mounds or caves or geology, anything like that whatsoever. So it was a bit of a spur of the moment thing. Everyone thought they were throwing their money away, but clearly they weren't, because Abe and I both have jobs, so something went right. As a little kind of additional fun fact, for the first 5 years of operation, the Cave of the Mounds opened for business in May of 1940. So just 9 months later, they worked very, very fast. We were actually managed by none other than the renowned geologist Alonzo Pond. So he was our manager during that time. He really kind of pushed for us to be a research-heavy facility. He wanted to discover things about caves. He wanted to learn things about caves. And because of him, we're actually one of the most researched caves in the entire nation. We're very, very lucky to have had him for the time that we had him. And now, we are back to Dear Abe.
So is this too dark, or I had trouble finding something between this and what we had before?
I like it, I think it makes the slides look great.
Stand?
It
Okay.
hides their faces more, so they like it.
Okay. I've already got the mask on. Okay. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of the, or show you more than tell you, I suppose, about the cave deposits or speleothems that are found in Cave of the Mounds. And I figure that you probably know the most familiar kinds already. So stalactites, stalagmites, you've probably heard of them. You might have heard of ribbon stalactites. Has anyone heard of those before? A few hands. Then, of course, columns, that's when a stalactite and stalagmite join together. And flowstone, this deposit that occurs when water is spilling down some kind of slope. So I just found a few pictures of some of the more unusual cousins of stalagmites and stalactites that we've got here in the mountains. First, I want to say a little bit about how these things develop. So here you see a drop of water dangling from a stalactite. You see these little crystals forming. That's the mineral calcite, which I'm sure you're familiar with. And all the formations in Cave of the Mounds are developed due to dripping water from rain and melting snow. And by the time it's gone through the soil, it's no longer pure rainwater. Because the soil, there's some carbon dioxide that is imparted to the water, and that turns it into a weak acid that can dissolve a little bit of calcite from the limestone above the cave. Now, as it's traveling down through the soil and the stone, it's not really interacting with the air. It's got this sort of pent-up CO2 that's enabling it to dissolve calcite. Once it reaches the air of the cave, it's a little bit like when you open a soda bottle. Suddenly, that CO2 has the opportunity to leave this water and reach the cave air. And as the water loses CO2, well then it's got to release some dissolved calcite. And so it may not be a fast process, but that gas exchange of CO2 from the water to the cave air, that's actually what causes the dissolved calcite to solidify in many cases. Now, I've also put this up on the screen so that you could sort of picture the crystals forming around the droplet. They actually form in a ring around those droplets that are dangling from the roof. So many of the stalactites display hollow centers, and some of the ones we brought in that you can look at later have that too. So now we're looking up at the ceiling at some stalactites, and you can really see, especially in some of the ones that have been damaged, the hollow centers are present. There are some neat stalagmites called beehive stalagmites. I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, Holly or Dr. Slaughter, I don't think scientists have an explanation yet for how these are formed, or why they have these particular ripples. We also have these cool structures called helictites, and these are, in our case, they're pretty small, but they're really weird. You can see that there's some things hanging off the stalactite that go in odd directions. Now you might say, how can that be? How can anything go against gravity? Well, we're not really sure, but there are a couple of possibilities and theories. One is that moving air can sort of influence where these calcite crystals grow. Also, capillary action, when water pulls itself along a thin gap or a thin tube without the aid of gravity or against gravity. That's another possibility. Another possibility is something called, I might be mispronouncing this, piezoelectric effect, when force on a crystal creates an electric charge. And finally, there might actually be small colonies of microbes on the surface of these structures that influence where those crystals develop. Here's another cool picture. This is a vintage postcard of this bizarre hockey stick shaped helictite. Here's a pool. This is up the other end of the cathedral room that Holly was showing you a moment ago with the 2 photos. And as you can see, around the pool, a little bit higher than the water is here, is this bumpy stuff that looks a little bit like broccoli. That's called cave coral. And it's a deposit that the water left behind close to the water level. So we think this indicates an old water level in this area. In the early 40s, during the beginning of the war, it was a wishing well. And actually, these pennies were donated to charities at wartime. This is a picture of a cool stalactite and stalagmite that may someday connect, but I put it up here to show you this extra cave coral so you can really see where the pool sometimes fills this room. You can see some shallow still pools in the background of this picture. I want to show you a few things that develop in pools like this. You might find cave rafts. Now, there are different things that are sometimes seem to fall under the name cave raft. To me, it sort of seems like we're getting a shelf-like skirt around objects that are already in the water, like some little stalagmites, perhaps. But you can also get flat layers of calcite that form on a still pool spontaneously, and then will stack up inside the water. Here's a cool one, dogtooth spar. We have a neat sample of that. This will just occur under water on the floor of the pool. And then this is maybe the coolest one. These are oolites, which are tiny little sphere-like structures where calcite deposits in layers around some central grain of limestone or sand. So here's a cross-section one. Holly mentioned Alonzo Pond, this archaeologist, geologist person who was the manager, and he wrote a little paper about these oolites, and this is one of the images from that old paper that he published. A couple of minerals besides calcite, iron and manganese rust. One example of that is goethite. And then real briefly, I'd like to talk about some of the research that's been done here recently. And that's really all thanks to scientists from right here at UW-Madison, including Dr. Slaughter from the Geo Museum, as well as a few other people who I'll mention later, and then also some scientists that they work with at University of Minnesota, I believe. Am I catching everyone? Yep, okay, so these scientists are looking at the speleothems. And as you might imagine, a speleothem is sort of like that stack of rocks in the illustration early on. They form in layers. So as a stalagmite forms, there might be a layer that forms here on the bottom first. Time passes, more calcite accumulates on top of that. More time passes, and the stalagmite grows upward like a stack of mixing bowls upside down. And so, because these things are long-lived and really slow growing, they actually store a lot of information about the past. And one reason you might want to study them is to learn about past climate. So scientists from UW have been working on these stalagmites and other features. They're really interested in the climate records that are contained within these stones. But we also get a lot of cool information about the cave itself while they're searching for broader clues about the climate in this part of the world. So let me show you a couple things they did. First, one thing they did is they looked at layers like this, and they sampled them with some kind of drill, and they analyzed that sample to determine the age of each layer. And they did this for, let's say, over 19 or so stalagmites and other deposits throughout the cave. This is showing some of the different locations that were sampled. And for each one of those spots, they obtained multiple ages. Some of the structures grew all the time. Some grew for a while and stopped, and then grew again. Some were old, some were young. And they analyzed these things, and they found a few spots where nothing was growing at all. In fact, there was one spot in particular, one spot in time, where really nothing was growing at all. None of these stalagmites grew, and it was particularly conspicuous. With some statistical analysis, they determined, it seemed likely that this was a time when really nothing was growing. And guess what this coincides with? You might see it's between 50,000 years ago and today. Yeah, it coincides with the peak of the Ice Age. So although Cave of the Mounds is found in the driftless area where there are no glaciers, this seems to show it was so cold there, no dripping water entered the cave. So the conclusion is there was probably permafrost at Cave of the Mounds during the last Ice Age, which is really cool. And one of the neat side effects, I guess, of all this research that they've done is that we find all these cool details about specific speleothems in the cave. One of them has turned out to be the oldest stalagmite yet dated in the Midwest. So nobody's published an older age yet. It's this one. It's about 257, 258,000 years old. Okay, and then there's another component of the research that's really hot off the press. This has to do with really, really small layers in the stalagmites and other features. So those layers we were looking at a moment ago, when they take one of these samples, it might be crossing multiple years of time. But what if we could look at one single year of growth? It turns out they have the power to do that using special microscopes that make the annual bands stand out, or sub-annual bands, I guess. You can see here this sort of bright, dark pattern. And it turns out one bright and one dark make a whole year. Not only that, the brightness indicates the wetter time of the year, because this fluorescence is coming from organic material. The more water that's coming in, the more organic material winds up in the stalagmite. Let me just ask you this. If supposing this image came from a couple years ago, what time of year do you think the bright band would represent? That's the rainiest time. What season do you think that would represent in a present day scenario? Spring, yeah. Spring or maybe late winter when snow's melting. Now, they can figure out what the air temperature was corresponding to these dark and bright bands by what they call isotope ratios of oxygen. And so if you look at a stalagmite from today, you'll find that yes, indeed, the air temperature corresponding to this bright band was springtime. But it turns out, if you go back farther, they find it's not the same. How do they do that? They've got to use a really small instrument. You can see here, this is a 1 millimeter scale. If you drilled a 1 millimeter hole, you wouldn't get just one band, you'd get like 20 bands. So they have to drill a really small hole to figure out those isotope ratios and determine which season it was that the bands were made. And to do that, they use this amazing thing that's just down the hall from here. Has anyone seen this before? So if you come in the front door, I believe it's pretty easy to see. It's called the SIMS, whisk SIMS. It basically makes those tiny holes and tells you what's there. You can analyze the isotope ratios that are present. They did it with one stalagmite from today. That's this one here, and they did it with one stalagmite from about 120,000 years ago. As expected, today's stalagmite showed wet springs, but the one from 120,000 years ago was flipped. It was sort of wet summers, dry winters. And that's significant because 120,000 years ago, that's the last time it was about as warm as it is now. So I hope I haven't gone into too much detail here and confused you. And I hope I'm actually asking the right things, Dr. Richard. If you want to chime in and correct me at all, go ahead. That concludes the part about the research. You're going to Holly again.
It is me again. You can tell Abe really likes the details.
Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to introduce the researcher at the end there. Cameron, she's the gal on the left here. This is mainly her project, both parts of it, and then those are her advisors. Sean is in the middle and Ian is on the right.
We're gonna zoom back out to the macro lens here. We have, of course, gone into great detail about specifically Cave of the Mounds. Like I said, and as Abe has extrapolated for us, we have done a lot of research, not just us, but people who are working with us. UW-Madison students are absolutely great for doing our work for us. It is phenomenal. Cave of the Mounds is, of course, a cave. Hopefully you can understand that by the name. Cave of the Mounds is the most common cave type in the world. There are a lot of different types of cave, and there's a lot of different types of cave depending on who you ask. Caves are not well researched. You don't really have a lot of really good info about them that's really consistent throughout the world. But I'm going to give you what I've found and what I've learned, and hopefully that kind of coincides with what you already might know. So we are, as I said, the most common cave type in the world. We are what's known as a solution cave, which is to say very easily that our cave has been a dissolved out hole in the ground. This cave would have formed when the limestone bedrock formed, some sort of crack or opening formed in that bedrock, and it allowed weak acids to enter into the bedrock itself and dissolve out this magnificent hole and structure, which gave way for the speleothems and the formations that Abe's already talked about here. Quite specifically, we are known as an epigenetic solution cave, which is to say our water that made us grow came from above us, came from above ground, above the soil. It's rainwater mainly, or winter melt-off. There are also types of caves known as hypogenic caves, and these caves are growing from water that is in the phreatic zone, the saturated layer below us where the aquifers lie, and that water comes up and dissolves it out. Our cave is really just the epigenetic, but caves like Mammoth Cave, which is also a solution cave, has both actions going. If you've ever been to Mammoth, you know that there's an area where you literally enter the aquifer room. It's quite a phenomenal experience. You can see here we are back to the karst topography, of course. We've already seen this image, thank you to Abe. But this is essentially how our cave is existing within the bedrock layer. This entire layer used to be saturated and filled with water when the cave was forming. That water has since flown away. It is no longer there. It's drained. And so Cave of the Mounds is no longer growing larger. The rooms within are the exact size, the maximum that they're going to reach unless we suddenly get a whole lot of flooding, although I don't think we're planning on it. So in order for our cave to grow, we need a lot of still water within it in order to eat away at the rock. But right now, we are just considered a living cave for the fact that our formations are still growing within. So all the speleothems, for the most part, the stalactites and stalagmites, those are all getting bigger with time. But the rooms themselves are maintaining their size. Now, speleology, of course, is the science of caves. It's the study of caves. So therefore, there's a lot of different types of caves. Wisconsin itself has around 4 or so caves, depending on what you consider a cave. In Wisconsin, generally speaking, we need 3 criteria, which you can see up on the board here. The first one is that it must be made of rock. Pretty simple. Cave has to be made out of rock. That's a fairly easy thing. It has to be made by natural forces. This can't be something where I go outside and I throw a bunch of rocks in a pile and then I crawl inside of it and I say, hey, I made a cave. Can't do that. It's not legal. So it has to be made of rock, made by nature, and it has to be able to fit a human being inside of it. Now this one's a little bit of a leeway area because the person inside the cave does not have to be as big as me or Abe or any of you folks. It can be as small as a baby human. And that's fairly easy to set a baby human inside of something and say, hey, we got ourselves a human inside of a cave. Very simple. This varies a little bit depending on what state you're in. I know in some southern states you actually have to have a set distance, a length from the opening to the end of the cave in order to be considered a cave. So this is going to vary between states and around the world. But in Wisconsin, this is the general rule of thumb that we kind of work with. Different caves around the world, starting with the ones that are found in Wisconsin. Aside from solution caves, we have sea caves. If anyone has been to the Apostle Islands or to even Door County, Cave Point State Park, you have likely seen sea caves. Now, geologists, of course, like to be really easy with how we name things, as I'm sure everyone tries to appreciate as much as they can compared to physics. But sea caves and all the other caves are going to be named for the force that caused them to be created. So sea caves, this isn't referring to just seas, of course, because Wisconsin is not connected to an ocean by any means. But we have rivers and we have lakes, and it's referring to marine or aquatic functions. So these are, of course, on Lake Superior, and as the water and the waves runs against them, it slowly erodes out that rock over time. So a sea cave is any cave that has been created by forces of water. In Wisconsin, we also have talus caves, and these can be seen in, well, Devil's Lake is the easiest spot to really say it. A talus cave is going to be a cave made out of a bunch of individual boulders and rocks and talus, which are the loose chunks that come off the sides of bluffs and mountains and hills, that are falling on top of each other in a great big pile in such a way that we get a nice little hole opening inside of them. So these can be seen mainly in mountainous areas, but I'm absolutely certain if you hike around in the right spots of Devil's Lake, you're going to find a whole bunch of these. Although personally speaking, I wouldn't really want to step inside one of them because knowing my luck, I would be as flat as a piece of paper at the end of it. Ice caves are also something that can be seen in Wisconsin. This is something that is, of course, generally seasonal. You have to have ice in order to consider it. And these can be seen, this one here, is the ice caves of the Apostle Islands. Ice caves have to have a certain amount of ice for a certain period of time, a certain amount of time in a given year. But you can see we've got ice all around the floor, ice outside of it, and a bunch of nice stalactites made by ice all throughout the cave. So this is considered a seasonal ice cave, and these can be seen, of course, in areas where it gets cold enough that you can have ice for most of the year. Outside of Wisconsin, we can get glacial caves. Now, obviously, this is a little bit of a quirk to the rule that you have to have a cave that is made of rock, otherwise it's not a cave. This is, of course, made of ice. It's inside of a glacier or an iceberg, which the only difference between the two is it on land or is it in the ocean? This one just happens to be on land, so it's a glacier. But these are formed from air pockets or from possibly melting ice at the edges, at the openings, so that you can walk inside of them, and they have this gorgeous blue tint to them, which I've always been phenomenally fond of. Aeolian caves are one of my personal favorites. This stuff back here is not water as it might look, I can't really tell, but it is trees and it is different flora and fauna in this area. Well, not fauna because that's not an animal. But these are something that form in desert biomes. These are formed when wind in an area cannot be kind of blocked. It picks up sediments like sand and it just carves out all of these different pockets and holes, which I think is very phenomenal. So these are, of course, going to be very commonly seen in places like Arches National Park, or the other areas of the American Southwest, or different Middle Eastern desert areas where you have high winds and a lot of sediments moving around. The final type that I'll mention are lava tubes, which if you're a touristy person and if you've been to California or Hawaii, you may have stepped foot inside of one of these. Lava tubes are an igneous, of course, function because lava, igneous rock. And this is essentially speaking what happens when you have a marshmallow and you're making s'mores and you burn the heck out of the outside of it and you peel off that burnt end and you're left with the ooey gooey center. That's essentially what happened here. So this outer crust was the outer crust of the flowing lava. It cooled faster because it was closer to the air, and then the inside, that was still molten and very hot, continued moving outwards and created these long tubes that you can see here. And they are very maze-like in certain areas, and they're very, very expansive, some of them going for miles upon miles upon miles. But these, of course, are not seen in Wisconsin because we didn't really have this kind of action during this time. Now, Cave of the Mounds, of course, still operates today. We have been operating since 1940, and we have a lot of reason for doing what we do. We, of course, operate as a tourist attraction. We are here and we exist to entertain folk, bring them in, show them the cave, and educate them on it like we've done for you guys here today. Cave of the Mounds is a fairly unique setting. You've seen a lot of pictures that Abe has provided, and some provided by myself. It's a very, very gorgeous cave all throughout the inside of it. So people do want to come see us. And because these people patronize us and they come and they tour the cave, we are able to stay funded and fund the research and the different kind of educational experiences like what we're giving you right now today consistently as we go. Because our main goal, as Alonzo Pond kind of laid the foundation of, is to educate and to learn the science of the cave. So in addition to the cave, we've kind of expanded ourselves above ground. So we're no longer just the cave. We have a lot of different kind of projects that we've been working on. So the main project that's been going for a very, very long time are these gorgeous prairie gardens. In our area, we were naturally a native prairie and savanna. We had these gorgeous flowing fields that were eventually wiped out when people came to the area to farm and to plant their own crops or to just create their homes and their buildings. We're working since about the 1990s or so. We have been working to kind of rejuvenate this, reseed the area, and we've got several acres now that have grown very spectacularly and meticulously by our general manager, Ann Westcott. She has worked very, very hard on these. In addition to the prairies, we also have this huge, gorgeous woodland area. In our property, we have what's called the Oak Valley Loop Trail, and that's what you're looking at here. This is something that we have worked very hard on to actually maintain. We have a lot of different oak species inside of our forest, and if you know anything about oaks, they're very, very slow growing, sturdy trees that get beaten out really easily by things like sugar maples and other fast growing trees. This is something known as oak regeneration that we've been working towards, and in fact, we've actually paired with the Groundswell Conservancy, which is a conservancy out of Madison. They operate in the Dane County area, that they have protected over 13,000 acres across just this kind of Dane County area. And they've worked very, very hard with us, and we've worked hard with them, and we've managed to protect around about 26 or so acres just of our property in an easement that's keeping it safe from a little township area that was starting to kind of progress towards our cave. So we've made a stop to that. It is now protected forever, and it's untouchable for them. So we worked hard to protect the native habitat. And in this area, despite the fact that it's right next to Cave of the Mounds, we have deer and squirrels and chipmunks and a whole variety of just plants and animals all throughout the area. So while it is very close to us as a tourist attraction, it is still very much wild nature. The final things are just images of the tourist aspect itself. If you came to Cave of the Mounds, you would immediately be met with the gem and mineral sluice area, which you guys may or may not have done at some point, and we actually have little free gemstone mining coupons for this up at the front counter if you guys should still choose to grab these. But this is something fun that gets people started with geology, because one of the main things we want to do is interest people. Not everybody in the Madison area is sitting in this auditorium right now listening to me talk, so not everyone is clearly interested enough in geology as you all are. We really want to encourage that in some of today's youth, and I've had tens of children just get so excited when you talk to them and listen about the difference between sedimentary and igneous and metamorphic rocks, because it's so easy to interest all these people. And we have geocracking as well, because who doesn't like a good little geode every now and then? The crystals are fun too. But these are just a couple things that's available at Cave of the Mounds, and we do hope that after seeing us, of course, that you may stop by for a visit. We're family friendly, of course. We want to have as many people as we can there, not just to give us money and see the cave, but to see the cave and to see the grounds and at least appreciate a little bit of the effort that we have put in on the day-to-day since our discovery back in 1939. And with that, I would say that we are all done.
You put the lights on.
At all about anything that Abe or I has mentioned? You have to have at least one question. Nobody gets to leave the room until I get a question. That's the rule. We got a question.
Several years ago, I had a chance to visit Lehman Cave on Great Basin National Park. And they are particularly known for their shield formations. Do you have any in your case?
We have some that are similar. Mainly speaking, the closest thing we have are the kind of just a centimeter tall rimstone dams that are on the Painted Waterfall Formation. They're not fully developed or formed quite yet. They're a fairly young formation, but that would be the nearest thing to their shields.
I'm not familiar with those. Are those the ones that look sort of like almost like a
shield.
semicircle coming out?
Yeah, they come out in all different orientations. Some grow on the floor, some grow from the ceiling. It's like there's no rhyme or reason to them, and they don't really know how they form.
That's about every speleothem imaginable, yeah.
Yeah.
It's a
I would
guessing
say we
game.
don't have that.
But they look like those, the old-fashioned round, like Roman shield type things.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I can picture that now.
Yes.
Do you have a favorite part of the cave, both of you?
Oh,
Fair enough.
very aggressive question, like answer now. Why don't you go first?
Yeah, so
You may
it's hard to
hesitate.
choose because I have a couple of favorites. I like the cathedral room because that's, and the following area, the column room, where you have so many helictites and other sort of delicate structures in the wall. But probably my favorite is the viewing spot, would just be the Dream River room. It's so long. If you're curious how that looks beyond that long segment of the map that Holly said, hard to access, there's some images of it on our virtual tour. It's kind of hard to find on the website, but we have a virtual tour and you can walk a little ways down that Dream River and see what it looks like.
I get asked that question a lot, and every time I have an answer that I immediately forget upon being asked. But I'm a big fan of an area called the Meanders, which is the only area in the cave that was carved out by the motion of water as opposed to the dissolution of the limestone, which I think is cool.
I think it's a cool spot.
Yes.
I was wondering how much movement of air there is in the cave, and can that have any response in how the crystals grow?
That is a very good question. So we are categorized as a breathing cave. So limestone, very, very porous rock, allows freely for the movement of water and air. So as we get air pressure changes outside of the cave, the air moves in and out. We're constantly getting a refresh. I'm not exactly certain how much data we have on the effect of the air circulation inside the cave. We of course get different effects based on, the formation of them themselves is due to the carbon dioxide getting expelled out of the water as it enters the cave. But as for how the different levels of oxygen versus the carbon dioxide affect it, we aren't entirely sure. Yes?
So on the map of the whole cave, there's what look like tiny little cavelets next to it.
Yes.
What are those?
So this is it was kind of sectioned off, and Abe, you're gonna have to buzz real quick if you want to get that map up
Yeah,
at
go
the
ahead.
beginning. I think what you're referring to is like the little section that was off on the side of it.
Yeah.
And that section is actually a lower level. So those are actually the meanders that I had mentioned before. You're almost there, a little bit further. So you talk too much about the research. So those are actually the meandering levels. They go down to a maximum depth of 70 feet below the surface. I think you're talking about this part on the left over here.
Yeah, and that other little tiny thing above it.
Yes. So on this side here, this is our legend. This here is our entrance level, and it's kind of set off to the side. This entryway is actually right here. But this area is the lower level, which starts right at this staircase here. So it'll actually continue downwards underneath the cave, and you'll actually come up on it on the tour over here, but it actually continues down for quite a ways in this direction. And like I said, this is the lowest point of the cave, 70 feet beneath the surface. So it's actually a fairly shallow cave. We're considered a surface cavern because we're so close. But the cool part about that is that because of that, we were discovered in the first place, because quarry workers are only going to go so far into the ground.
There's a little piece on the upper right called Surprise Cave. That's actually a separate adjacent cave that was revealed as they built the tunnel that leads to the last viewing spot.
So by all means, we are not the only cave just on our property, and not the only cave, of course, in this area of Wisconsin. There are tons and tons of caves hidden within karst topography that we just haven't discovered yet, which is quite neat. And I think that answered your question, hopefully.
Yeah.
Otherwise, I've just been talking in circles. Yes?
In this cave, also history of a big field of clay and then having running water cutting the average of the clay.
In this area, with the clay mechanic, we didn't really get much of the soft material, which I think is what you're asking. But
The history of some caves involves a total filling with clay, and then water comes flowing through it very fast and cuts a meandering niche into the wall on either side of the cave, and the clay gets washed out later on, and the niches remain in the wall, indicating where the water has turned corners and gone around.
right, yes. There is a possibility, of course, that happened in certain spots, especially in the cathedral room where we have a lot of kind of circular areas, which may have turned due to the having of clay. But We haven't, to my knowledge, discovered a lot of evidence of ever being significantly filled with different silts or sediments during that time. We do have cave mud. That is not to say that we are a perfectly clean cave. Every cave comes with its mud. But our mud is really strictly in the lower levels of the cave areas.
Yeah, I don't know much about the clay either, in terms of that.
Yes.
Some 10 or 15 years ago, we had this immense rainstorm that dumped 10 inches of rain, especially to the west of Madison. What, if anything, happened to the water level within the cave?
Was that like the 1,000-year event that really hit Madison bad?
It was a storm that put Bernie's underwater.
Yeah.
Oh, no, Bernie.
'Cause I haven't worked there for 10 years, but I know there was, like 7 or 8 years ago, there was a pretty bad event. And Madison was maybe one of the worst spots.
I don't recall the year that happened, but it was a 10-inch storm.
Yes.
At least during the one I'm thinking of, it, to my surprise, didn't affect the cave as much as I expected. In fact, we had seen more water come in previous years leading up to that year. That particular event there was more water for sure, but it wasn't anything that flooded the trail or anything like that.
The
So-
thing about rain and water and snow melt off is that we're actually above the water table where we are. We're in the southern slope of the eastern Blue Mounds, which is the second highest point in southern Wisconsin. So we're anywhere from 300 to 500 feet above the aquifer itself. So with regular rainfall or even catastrophic flooding, as you were referring to, that occurred, we don't get a huge amount of fluctuations or effect by that. That isn't to say that we can't get enough water, that we do get fluctuations in some areas. We do have a fail-safe in the form of pump systems inside of our cave. So if some of our stagnant water does rise up to certain levels, it's redirected to the lower areas. But just regular rainfall or even that torrential downpouring that we were getting, it doesn't really affect us as much as one would think that it would. Yes?
Are you aware of Pop's Cave?
Pop's Cave.
I've been there. I was
Have you
a
been
kid.
there?
Yeah, I
Oh,
was
is
a
that?
kid.
The one I was there too as a kid.
All right. That was
Everybody
fun.
went
Oh, I haven't heard of any people going there recently,
Is
but
that
I'm
in
also
Granite
not really on
County?
the scene. I don't know, it's a little west of where we are, I think, but I could be wrong.
I think I know the one you're talking about because I'm from that area, but I've never been to it personally.
My sister visited me from the New England area,
Mm.
and she was a very curious person. She was always pursuing things to learn more. And there was one cave, now I can't remember if it was Pops or what, but she found a guy at the university who was willing to take her down into another cave, which I think was Pop's Cave. And they actually found a room down there in which there was a pond.
Mm.
And it sounded very interesting. They had to go in their bellies in muddy water a little bit.
Yes. Yeah, lots of kind of the off-road caving experience, compared to the show caving experience is going to be getting very wet and very muddy 90% of the time. But it may very well have been Pop's Cave, but I haven't been there, unfortunately.
I'm not quite as adventurous as my sister.
Not quite, no. Yes?
I haven't been to Cave Mounds since I was a kid, so I really don't remember. How accessible is the cave?
That's a very good question. So while we do have, of course, fully paved concrete tactile walkways, there are approximately 9 staircases throughout. Every part of the walkway does have handrails, of course, alongside of it. So if you can manage stairs without your walker, you could very easily manage that because they're throughout the cave. But that said, things like wheelchairs or the walker itself wouldn't be able to go in. It is a very nice figure 8 loop. So you enter in the center of the cave and you're never more than about 2 minutes from the exit should you decide that you really don't want to complete the whole thing. But there's also a bench inside. So if you get halfway and decide you just want to sit down and relax and enjoy the area you're in, you're more than welcome to do that too.
Now, if the walker folds up and can be carried up the stairs, is that what?
I'm not
Or
sure.
if they don't let them in?
Yeah, we typically just don't let them in.
Sometimes it's a case-by-case basis. So if you really pledge your case with our manager, she might make an exception. But that would be something you'd have to speak with her about. But if you are unable to get into the cave, of course, as Dave mentioned, we have a fully virtual tour that you can click through. It's actually pretty cool. I've seen it myself, and it actually takes you off-roading in the cave. So that Dream River section, the very long one with all the delicate formations, you actually get to go down about 50 feet of that, which is actually super phenomenal and really, really gorgeous if you're curious. And that's on the website. Any other questions from you folks? All right, then oh, yes?
Any of you been in Horseshoe Bay Cave in Door County?
I haven't, although I was actually just in Door County and I begged my sister to let me go and she did not, but I've seen so many pictures of it, it looks phenomenal. It looks pretty cool.
I'd like to see that too.
It's neat.
Hey, thanks so much for having us here. It's really fun to speak with you. Sure.
Yes, so I was just about to mention, we're gonna leave these up here for a full tenure here, so if anybody's curious to come see some of the formations, these were from Cave of the Mounds. We didn't just go through knocking everything down with a sledgehammer. These were natural falls and fells throughout the cave that were kind of removed during the kind of walkway process as we were developing it. But we have a ton of different examples. We have things like flowstone segments over here that has some gorgeous layering that you can maybe see from the distance that you guys are at now. We have some stalactites, which are of course the ones in the ceiling with the hollows, some stalagmites, and then the dogtooth spar, the cave corals, as well as a very lovely gastropod that Abe snuck into the box, so you guys can see one of our nice fossils as well. And then of course we have Cave of the Mounds brochures over here, and the free gemstone mining coupons if you guys are interested in doing that as well. So these will be up here the whole time if you want to come up and see them, but I think we will release the floor perhaps to our...
Well, thank you so much for coming, we do appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right, folks, competition. Gemini. Yes, got it right this time. Do we have entrance for the contest? Are there people entering that? If so, please go and vote.
Entries, yeah, put your entries.
And be sure to stop by and wish Bernie a very happy birthday. All right, I think that does it for the meeting. Remember, next month we have the lava flows of Lake Superior.
Great.
Where is the picnic going to be?
It's out at the same place it's been previous years.
I wasn't there last.
Oh, sorry.
Yes, you were, I told you. Yeah, you were.
And there's birthday cake for Bernie. They have lots of cake in it.
Oh, nice. If Bernie shares with us, of course.
Bernie, do you want to go cut your cake first?
Oh, and we had a very nice memorial session for Carlos this past Saturday. I don't know how many people were able to get there. It was very nice. Thanks to the geology people for handling that. Open the museum. All right, I think we're good. Go vote. Come see Rob. Hands off my
Doors are open.
No, I can't wait for the cake. It looks good.
Yeah.
As in depth as you can.
Hey, good to see you, Mel.
Like, they're not showing, they're not gonna be dressed like, because they're usually just gonna pass. Did you? That's quite fun. Oh, really?
Yeah. Okay, really.
We have a lot of, outreach tours and things like that, but we don't really do like a fun activity.
When I was out there, I was trying to see if that place still existed. A whole bunch of basically, they even had a back there. We like this whole area, those things are.
We're actually thinking about bringing that back, so if you want to stop by and see if you can get it, it looks like same size as home.
I think I got through the small section.
Not confident? Okay, alright.
I'll get some more from it after this, we dive open.
Yeah, it's a little as you do.
Probably eel runner, the eel runner. Longest on.
Yeah, sure, I think so, right? I mean, people like.
I mean, I tried to choose.
Yeah, there's some more things there.
Yeah.
So that's really
Now
you're like, oh, not as cool.
Yeah, for Tuesday, I'll try to see it,
Yeah.
Yeah, Tuesday, 6th.
Then you'll have. You guys practice so great because overall.
So I'll be there, multiple trainings, these guys, yeah. Utilities standing together.
Yeah, we just love you guys. Possible a lot of well, it's like the number one destination for this area. It's super fun.
Yeah, usually often. Yeah. I don't know, they just have it's like, I don't know what's there. Just tell me how much it'll cost, and then we can move forward.
Just a baby.
Where's your bag? Oh, yes, we're there, oh.
Bernie was curious about, if you know some people who were there at the time when they.
Yeah, I've been to a horseshoe band. I was the one who was least money because I was able to crab along and didn't want to get on my knees. Scratchy around.
Brothers.
I thought it was Larissa.
Was there when they.
Happy birthday,
There
Mark.
was different caves she came. I just remember she was stuck in the
Anyway,
cold water for so long.
It's a lot of work to get there.
That was one of the Boy Scouts. That's her cave she came.
It's,
Hello, Bernie. What do you mean? All you gotta do is keep breathing.
That looks like,
You do elbows?
Cave corals, are those formed by like stalagmite getting eroded? Just no deposition?
Yeah.
Okay. So what was stalagmite that got grown? How do you think it?
Yeah, this was actually,
Drinker's cancer.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, it's definitely stand for it.
Yeah, if you ever get a chance to go in that cave, and just shine that sucker around and right up the walls with it, and the water glows. Yes.
Going back to round two?
Good, happy birthday, buddy.
Shall we go back to round two?
Yeah, the black lights are on.
Check them out. Hello there, birthday boy.
Talk to you about that.
then we turned it over and some pine like fell in.
You can see the swirl.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, we're leaving a little bit.
That's why it fell out of this one. Imagine.
Fred Lawrence, and he worked on that farm.
Lemonade's a generic term for a whole lot of the really It's kind of like,
Right, yeah. We have a whole bunch of info on it. I haven't heard specific, was it Fred Burke?
It includes
You said? Fred Burke. Fred Burke. I haven't heard that name specifically, however, we do have a lot of historical information. We're out there. And to keep track, the main ones, of course, are like Lance Dodge and Charles Brigham Jr. Those folks.
If you break it, you buy it.
Remember that he told us about it, not do that.
20,000. I have no idea what this
There's
was.
some names though on these.
Yeah, I think it was
But
I think it would be hollow except for it's filled with
Right, yeah.
It's naturally all
No,
shiny.
we definitely have a lot of info. I'll certainly ask around for the story. She does so much research and she's constantly reaching out to people, so she probably has the knowledge you're looking for, I'd say.
Well, it's also shiny and expensive.
Yes. The little handle, but not as much as this one. That's
So you have one of the farm workers, not the quarrymen? Right. That's so fun, because we don't usually hear about the farm workers, we usually hear from the quarry workers. They're straws coming down. It's definitely fun to have the perspective of the farm worker, who is just there.
Who's actually a world-renowned concrete expert of all things.
Yep.
Was been
Yeah, the
mowing
whole
queue
thing
over
was
at
the
the
farm, all the way up
Union
until the 1980s,
because
actually,
the
so about 40 years even after the cave was discovered, they still worked those cattle.
metal formations coming out of it.
Anybody in engineering or was to work in that building.
Yes.
Find it in front of classroom.
Yeah, there's that too.
They've been meaning to tear that down for what, 20 years?
No, we have to make sure they love everything, we only get one time around the earth, so might as well, I'll definitely ask her, but I don't remember everything, but I think that'd be fun, and if I find someone, I'll probably email Al and tell them to pass on your perspective. Did you want to see? Did you enjoy it? That's good, I'm glad you did, it's our first time doing this.
And the air movement.
Yes.
Bad building.
Really?
But that was PRB, now the humanities, humanities is dreadful. That's a PRB building.
It's our first time ever doing program with architecture, so we're glad that you enjoyed it.
Ruralist architecture, anybody take some pictures.
Did you enjoy that?
You need to know how to copy it. Replace it with something that humanities can present.
But you had the pretty pictures at the
Yeah,
beginning.
something that's not, the only good thing about that building is when I was a kid, I would run up and
Did
down.
you see any of, did you see any of these that are over here? I can bring some over to you.
Yeah, oh, they yelled at us.
I'm not sure.
All right.
It might have been longer.
Oh, good.
This has a little piece on it.
Good, absolutely. I'm glad you did.
Yeah,
So
so
thank you
that's
so
the
much
light
for
ones go back.
it. And happy birthday to you once again. Good job.
Yeah, the oldest line is 250.
Arch down the water.
We don't really know when
Like
the
dragon or,
following process.
like a reptile.
Also, you have to enter your phone in the.
I don't know, I haven't looked at it. Well, I don't, what do I have in it?
Yeah.
I don't know, I don't have anything.
Somewhere I read, 1.8 million.